So one of the reasons at Here to Here, we often ask people what their first paid work experience is often what we learn in those experiences speak to what we think about what we want to do and what we don't want to do going forward. And in the context of youth talent development, we feel like this self-learning and understanding about yourself and what your interests are and what your talents are and where you can get paid for it is so important as part of the youth development framework. We believe so critical to embed in any career success strategies. And so it's always interested, and I'm gonna ask the panel as a kickoff to really speak to that as we jump into the discussion, which we will do. It's 3:05 now, so I'm going to go ahead and kick off. Cherise, can we move from the introductory slide to the panelists? Thank you. Just quickly before we jump in, Joshua, do you want to be a panelist or because you're showing up on the slides? Up to you. And same with Cherise. Okay, so thrilled to be here. I'm missing one person. Maybe it's my presentation, but Apoor should be on here. So while I do the introduction, Cherise, could you please figure, and Apoor, could you please figure out how we get Apoor up here? All right. So first of all, welcome everybody. I'm thrilled that we're having this panel. I think it's very timely in terms of the conversation. And as I looked at the attendee list and look at the folks who have signed on, we have such a great mix of folks. We have folks who are students, who are employers, who work at post-secondary institutions, who work at high schools, who work at community-based organizations. And I think all of us are very interested in what do we as individuals and we as institutions need to do differently so we can really help students, Bronx and New York City students, launch into family-sustaining careers. And we know that that is something that we need to do and have needed to do and think about more intentionally for a long time. But I'll talk more about that later. Right now, I really want to just introduce the panel. And I want to make sure we get the technology a little bit right. All right, there's Apoor. And I want to highlight one of our students, unfortunately, Cherise, was unable to join because she unfortunately got food poisoning and isn't feeling so well. So we're wishing her a speedy recovery. And we miss her because her perspective would have added another dimension. But fortunately, we also have a recent student, Zamaris Molina, who can hopefully help give us some insights into her experience, and then given all of our own work with young people, more recent experiences at CUNY. So with that, what I want to do in terms of today is make sure we introduce the panel. We give Zamaris some time to sort of share her recent experience so we can all sort of get back into the groove and have a deeper understanding of what it's like to be a younger person really launching into career, coming from going to high school in the Bronx, and just sort of get back and get her insights into that and help us sort of think about what that experience is. Then we'll have a conversation. Julia will speak a little bit about the big picture, but then we'll really hear from Dean Schultz to hear about his new book and the great work that he and thought and insights that he put into that around reinventing the community college business model and what that really means in terms of the work we're all trying to do. And we hope to mobilize a whole lot of other people to help get the work done. And then we'll reflect on that in terms of the context. And at the end, we'll open it up to questions. So please start putting your questions into the chat, and we'll keep track of them. And we hope to have a robust Q&A session for about a half an hour at the end. All right, panelists, are we good to go? Apoor, whatever you just did was pretty psychedelic in the fading in and out of the background. Cool.
I tried.
So I'm thrilled to have everyone here. I think I know most of the people who are attending, but there are also some new names for me. A little bit just about here to here. You know, we were set up really with the goal of helping students launch into family sustaining jobs by the time they're 25, and really working with everybody involved. So employers, post-secondary institutions, community-based organizations, K-12 organizations, to help align around that goal. And for us, you know, we know that we've known in the past year for sure, particularly with the pandemic, but for the past 5 years, or even for the past 40 years, we've witnessed significant disruptions in how the labor market works and how it doesn't work. And so as we've looked forward, we've recognized that sort of key to addressing how we address that disruption to this labor market is really looking at our educational institutions and our employers and how they work together and how they partner. And we know that for this to happen well and happen at scale well means that community colleges, and in particular CUNY community colleges, really need to play a catalytic role, building on all of the good work they're already doing, but also the change they need to do given these outside disruptions. And that's really how we get to a thriving, inclusive economy. And so the panelists today and the discussion today, I really hope we can explore that question and really do it based on the framework that Dean Schultz has developed in his book. Hopefully after this, some of you will actually, if you haven't already, get his book and read it, because there's so much important information there and how we think about moving this work forward so that we have better outcomes for students, for employers, as well as for the economy. And so since everybody has access to the bios, I thought rather than my asking everybody to sort of introduce in detail who they are, I would ask them to, you know, say who they are, the organization they're with, the reason they're on this panel, and also how their first job or what their first job was that gave them, that really helped them drive them to where they are today. And why don't we start with Dean Schultz?
Well, good afternoon. My name is Christopher Schultz. I'm the Dean of Institutional Effectiveness and Strategic Planning at the Borough of Manhattan Community College. The reason I'm here today is because we're delving into the book that I had the honor of writing, and look forward to talking about it and its implications, frankly, beyond just community colleges, but really to the broader nonprofit world. Really makes a great deal of sense. My first paid job, I worked at age 14. I was hired to work in the kitchen at a religiously based nursing home. It was quite an experience. It taught me, frankly, respect for different ways of viewing the world, seeing how individuals with different experiences coming from different places at different ages see the world differently, and how to respect that and work with people who have different, perspectives. And frankly, I think that was probably my entree into the nonprofit, social service, social justice, values-based work that I find so important and endearing today.
Thank you. Zamaris, why don't we turn it over to you to introduce yourself?
Hi there. So my name is Samaris Molina. So I'm currently a John Jay student. I'm pursuing my master's degree there. I'm currently working with Weill Cornell as a customer service representative. I'm aiming towards learning the system that is involved with not just Cornell, but just hospitals, period, as I'm looking to expand my knowledge in like technology, as that's where, I get extremely passionate about technology and just being challenged all the time. My first job was actually with Children's Aid. They actually had a little office in my high school. I started high school at 13. And if it wasn't for them, I don't know who I'd be today. They kept me off the streets. They kept me pretty occupied. They they kept me pretty engaged in school and my academics, obviously because I had to be a role model to other kids, but they also provided me with hands-on experience with what it is to have a job and have responsibility. With that said, that first job I had was an after-school counselor at the middle school for Fannie Lou. So I was kind of like, you know, in my mind, I have to be a role model for these kids. I have to be a leader, not a follower, with always that in the back of my mind. And the reason why I'm here today is because, you know, I'm interested in sharing my wisdom and like my experience with other youth and other people. Just, you know, you could shed some light on things that could be improved or could be better. It could help the youth have better opportunities that maybe you didn't have. While I do feel like I had a great experience, things could use some improvement. And I'm sure till this day, things could improve a lot more with technology advancing and, you know, us having so much more than we had maybe 7-8 years ago when I was in school and I was just getting stuff going for myself. But that's my intro.
Thank you, Zamaris. How about Apoor? We'll switch to you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Apurva Mehrotra. I'm the Director of Research and Analytics at Here to Here. So really focusing on sort of documenting, you know, our work within the organization, as well as sort of learning from so much of the amazing work that's happening, you know, all across this city, all across this country, really, and sort of codifying sort of best practices in an effort to really sort of drive our systems forward in a way that best serves young people, our educational institutions, employers, and the city at large. My first job was actually when I was 15 or 16 years old. It was at the Dollar Tree store in my local mall, small town, small mall. I wouldn't say that necessarily was the first job that sort of kind of led to me being where I am now. I think that would have to be a few years later when I was in college and I was working for a program at the time. It was called America Reads. I was basically sort of serving assistant, a classroom assistant, a elementary school. It's sort of in the Lower East Side, East Village of Manhattan. And I think that was the first job that really sort of started making me think about what I had to do in the future and how what I wanted to do in the future, you know, really, you know, should be something that, if not education itself, something sort of related in terms of sort of public service and really sort of addressing the disparities that exist between communities in the city. So that was probably the first job that really sort of got me thinking in the direction that led to me being where now.
Thanks, Apoor. Julia, let's go to you.
Yeah, thanks so much, Abby Jo. I am Julia Freeland Fisher. I'm the Director of Education Research at the Clayton Christensen Institute, which is a small think tank that studies innovation in the public sector. I grew up in Oakland, California, and I'm the daughter of a psychiatrist, which is like super telling. Now you don't need to know anything else about me. But I inherited my first job through my dad because he was connected to an insurance company. And I was, as a 16-year-old, this is ridiculous, I was checking up on whether mental health professionals' licenses were up to date and flagging in a very complex, not cloud-based system, whether or not they were. And I will say, Abby Jo, I've never thought of this, but it really did give me an appreciation for how immensely complex systems are, right? And a lot of what we think about in innovation theory, and what I think we're going to talk about today, is how to innovate in the face of that complexity and not let it sort of just stifle change. But yeah, that's my story, and super excited to be here.
Thank you, Julia. My first paid work experience, well, was babysitting, but the first paid work experience where not all of the money came directly to my pocket, as many kids are surprised or young people are surprised, was at a concession stand where I learned how to scoop ice cream, make French fries, and mop floors. But what I really took away from it is, A, I didn't want to mop floors and scoop ice cream and make French fries, but also very much that I liked interacting with all different types of people. And that I found very invigorating and interesting, and something that I've carried on in any role I've had, is try to make sure I'm not talking to the same type of people every day. And this call certainly represents that, and certainly the work of systems change requires that. So I hadn't taken it to that level, Julia, so thank you for that. Cherise and Joshua have been incredibly helpful in helping to organize this panel technically and otherwise, as has Tueri and Emily from our team. That's why you're seeing Joshua and Cherise's pictures. Joshua and Cherise, if we can't figure out how to take your pictures down, I might pull you on to answer some of the questions. So just forewarn that if they stay there, that will be my instinct, because I see you front and center. So I want to really kick it off with Zamaris right now, and really hear from you, your experience in both beginning in high school and going to post-secondary specifically, just so we have some context of a particular experience. I also ask everybody in the audience, all the attendees, to think about their experience or the folks they work with or the folks or their families in terms of the experience and the roles that that other folks are seeing. Sorry, someone's saying you're not seeing Cherise and Joshua's panel in my notes. So, okay, good, excellent. And really think about it in terms of people's lived experience, because the best way to design a system is to think about the people who are involved in it, benefiting from it, or should be benefiting from it. So with that, Samaris, I turn it over to you for a couple minutes.
Hi there. So I know my experience at college, because I started off at BMCC, which is a 2-year community college. When I started there, I went in with every single remedial class you could think of: the writing, the reading, the math. Obviously, back in my time in high school, I didn't take the exams as serious that could kind of get you out of remedial. I remember clearly going into my first semester at BMCC, I kind of tested out of the writing, but I still was juggling the reading and the math. Within the first semester, I banged out my reading. That's no question, because these classes kind of, for people who don't know, remedial classes stop you from taking your actual classes because they're prerequisites to take certain classes. So I was stuck with my math for forever. It took me 6 years to complete my 2-year degree at BMCC. One of the things that did not work well for me, that could have been better, was if the advisors that I constantly met with were in alignment. And the reason I say that is because it wasn't until maybe like my 4th year at BMCC, which my math was stopping me from taking all the core classes that entailed math, such as statistics, physics, which were requirements for me to complete my degree. It wasn't until I met with one of my professors that I was really close with, and I established some sort of relationship with her. She offered to advise me that semester, and I was like, well, great, I don't have to go see any of these advisors, I can meet with you. And she's like, Samaris, why are you still taking this remedial? You do not need algebra. You could take literacy. I was a criminal justice major. Had it not been for that, I probably would have still been at BMCC trying to complete that remedial, because I suck at algebra, God knows. But from that experience, I managed to go into, obviously, John Jay, my 4-year school, and I established a great relationship with my advisor, which was my advisor for the 2 years that I set myself to make sure that I was not dropping classes, that I was staying committed even when it got tough. So I disciplined myself to give myself that 2 year exactly or sooner to finish. And my advisor was so great. He actually had even offered some insight on how I could obtain my degree quicker, because I had a lot of electives that I had to complete. He offered me this thing called CLEP. CLEP is, you could take any language you like or a subject you like. And he's like, take the Spanish one. If you do really well, which your Spanish is really good, and I think it sucks. If it's really good, you could get 9 credits out of this. I paid $80 and I got myself 9 credits, and I saved myself a whole semester at John Jay that I would have had. It would have been 2.5 years for me to finish. And had it not been for that and that information and my advisor being so efficient and so informed, I would have probably still have spent another $2,000 to complete that. But we're talking about the things that didn't work so well. But the things that did work well that BMCC did offer me was this program called At Home in College. So the motivation behind it was obviously your free Metro card. You didn't have to pay for Metro card. You attended twice a week a workshop, which entailed like improving your skills, your work skills, you know, how you dress, attire, which, you know, it keeps you motivated. It shows you things that, you know, people just don't willingly just give you that information. And as a young student, you just don't know. That opportunity allowed me to work between my classes, works similar to like work study. And that actually got me by in school too pretty well. So that definitely did work well. And that is all I have.
Thank you, Zamaris. I think that's really helpful because I think as we're all thinking about our experiences or those that we know or work with, a lot of what you said resonates. And I think particularly as we're thinking about, okay, how do we make this work for all students, particularly young students coming out of New York City high schools, getting the, you know, what really worked and what really didn't work, and making sure that it's not, that we think about in the context of the overall institutional design, super important. And your framing of it's been really helpful, at least for me, in terms of how we think about it. I'm sure Chris is writing a number of notes right now in terms of how he thinks about it in the context of his work. But before we turn over to Dean Schultz, I really want to hear from Julia Freeland Fisher. As some of you know, she's a returnee to the Here to Here stage. We did have her do a book talk on her book, Who You Know, which if you haven't read it, I recommend it. Really talking about the importance of professional networks and social capital for students in terms of life success, something that we all know. It's sometimes like stating the obvious, but how do we have institutional design that supports that? But I was really eager to have Julia come back today, in part because of the work she does more broadly at the Christensen Institute on Disruptive Innovation, and particularly as it relates to K-12 and higher ed, and sort of the institutional work. So without further ado, Julia, I'd love to turn it over to you to speak a little bit about that, and then you're on for turning it over to Dean Schultz. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, Abby Jo, and thanks, Samaris, for sharing your reflections. So I'm mostly here to just tee up Dean Schultz's great comments, and I'm going to share. I own his book, and it is one of the few books I own on Kindle. I don't make it a policy to support Amazon, but I was so desperate to read it that I wanted to buy it in one click, and I encourage you guys to do that as well, because it is it fills a huge gap in the literature. And I was excited to read it because Clay Christensen, who unfortunately passed away last year, but was our founder of our institute, when he developed the theory of disruptive innovation, he really focused on business model innovation. But that is like this very loose concept. Typically, people sort of wave their hands and talk about business models. In education, it can sound kind of gross and unappealing to say that there is an education business model, but without business model innovation, you don't get disruptive innovation. And without disruptive innovation, you cannot scale affordable and accessible experiences, which to me is the premise of our community college system, not just in New York, but beyond. And I think I'll say on behalf of Clay, he would have been really excited about the work that Dean Schultz has produced here. Many years ago, Clay actually wrote that community colleges stood to be a disruptive innovation in and of themselves because they are so focused on access and affordability, because they are trying to lower the opportunity cost, not just in terms of the price tag, but the amount of time it takes to earn a credential. But that disruption really hinges on the ability to be sustainable. And for that disruption to be a good thing, it hinges on the ability to be student-centered in the pedagogical and sort of student support designs. And I think community college sustainability and pedagogy are both sort of under question right now. This is again why I'm excited for Dean Schultz's comments, because in my experience looking at sort of innovation in higher ed, there's the folks that talk about pedagogy and student support, and there's the folks that talk about the dire financial straits, and rarely the two shall meet, partly because of the silos of our structures. The ability to actually talk about both sides of the operation is the way that we think sort of change can happen long term. The last thing I want to just sort of point out is that sometimes when people wave their hands and talk about disruptive innovation, it's referring to a single company or a single institution that comes along and succeeds wildly and changes the world. But actually, an axiom in our research is that systems disrupt systems. A kind of silly example from outside of education, if you think about the rise of the Sony Walkman back in the day, not to like fully date myself, but those Walkmen were possible in part because Bell Labs back in the 40s developed this tiny thing called a transistor. And they were possible because Sony took that transistor and did something amazing with it, which was created these much more affordable consumer electronics. But when those first came out, sort of transistor radios, nobody wanted to sell them because the stores that were selling more expensive tabletop radios made their money by repairing those radios. So they were not interested in this new disruptive product. And it wasn't until the Kmarts of the world came along and there was a way to sell more affordable consumer electronics that they got into the hands of eager teenagers. And I say that not to celebrate the Kmarts of the world or the Sonys of the world, but to point out the fact that you need many parts of a system to work together to get to new heights as an industry. And I think hopefully today's conversation, given who's in the audience, we're not just talking about a single community college changing the way it does business, but actually how that community college and institution interacts with employers, high schools, and nonprofits in a coherent student-centered way. So yeah, I couldn't be a bigger fan of this book, and I'm excited to turn it over to Dean Schultz to talk through his blueprint for really the future of community colleges and beyond.
Well, I appreciate that introduction, and hearing that this is something that would have been in alignment with Christensen's thinking is that's high praise. I very much value the work that he and those who have continued the disruptive innovations research have done. Those are hard conversations for us to have in the community college world. For too often we've kind of avoided them with sort of a little bit of nostalgia that we'll go back to times of really good funding at the state level. We'll go back to times where we had a lot of free reign in regards to less compliance, less rigorous oversight. And the truth is there's no indication that that's ever going to happen. And certainly what's happened with technology has transformed everything. I mean, the truth of the matter is we couldn't be conducting college courses right now in a virtual setting had we not been pushed by for-profits some years ago to get into the online game. So good disruption can come from, in some cases, areas outside of what we would consider to be positive. In the community college world, you're not going to get a lot of people who think too positively about the for-profit education world, but the truth is, they focus on business models. They know who they're serving. They know how to serve them, and they're continuously, relentlessly assessing and evaluating the degree to which individuals are meeting their expectations. So I was going to start with that to say really why I chose to write the book. But based on what Zamaris and based on what Julia shared, there's really a couple of quick points that I think point to it more than anything. And most importantly was Samaris's story. That's why a book like this is necessary. We have very good intentioned folks within our colleges. We have a number of people who could be in corporate America, who could be making a lot more, but because of their value systems, they choose to work within our community college system because their heart is in it. And they believe in the social, and this is a social business model, they believe in the social benefits that come from working in higher ed and especially community colleges, but we get in our own way. We've got outdated practices. We don't challenge things. Far too often we've been reactive as opposed to proactive when it comes to making major change. And Zamaris's story shows you what the problem is. At its core, it is, do we indeed provide this exceptional student value proposition, which I'll get into the 4 parts of the book in just a couple of minutes, but that value proposition is what value does a student obtain by coming to this college? And it's not just about a credential. You can get a credential anywhere, but it's about the educational experience. And in hearing from Zamaris, we can hear what we hear from so many students is that it's not guided enough. It's not streamlined enough. There's not enough direct support. Students sometimes flounder, take too many courses, are directed in ways they shouldn't have been. One good thing I can say is that there will be no more developmental education in CUNY within a year and a half. We've gone to a full co-requisite model, so stories like that won't happen again, thankfully. That was a long time in the making, and that's a best practice that some colleges have been doing for 20 years, but that's the problem. We've got certain pockets of innovation in certain parts of the country. I'm newer to New York, right? I'm not a native New Yorker. I can't say I'm from the Bronx or from one of the boroughs, right? I'm newer to this. So I come from seeing things in other places. And as an outsider to New York, I came into New York thinking, this is Manhattan, this is New York, this is the epicenter of innovation. I'm sorry, it's not. Like, there's pockets of innovation all over the country. And unless we're really working together. So I've worked with 4 different accrediting bodies. I've worked in 6 different states. I've worked with 200, 300 presidents at this point. So I've had a chance to kind of see and explore. I was developing leadership development institutes at age 26 with NAFIO over, my historically Black colleges. So I've been fortunate to have a lot of experiences that showed me a lot of what's wrong, but also a lot of what could be right. And so that was really what inspired me to write this book, as well as what Julia was talking about. When I would look, and in doing the research for this book, which, by the way, it was a year and a half of research. There's almost 300 references in this publication. It was my attempt to have a one-stop shop to begin the conversation of business models in community colleges. My hope is that others, researchers, our faculty who are really focused in organizational change, organizational management, or other areas will take it on and hopefully take it further. But there was no one source. A lot of times the organizational business model was the strategic plan, or it was an academic master plan, or in, God forbid, some cases, the financial plan, as if what should drive all of our decisions in a social business model should be dollars and cents. That should never be the case. The dollars and cents, they have to work for us to support our mission, but that's often not the case. So the business model for community colleges it's an organizational framework that is really designed to guide all of the operations that occur within the college. And as Julia said before, it's a place where it's not just talking about pedagogy, or just talking about systems, or just talking about assessment or accreditation or student support or basic needs or finance. The idea is that there has to be an operational framework which brings all of that into alignment, because it's too easy to be siloed in our institutions. It's understandable why it happens, but part of the reason it happens is there's not a structure so that it doesn't. So in taking a look at the 4 basic aspects of the business model within a community college, in typical corporate business models, you see the customer value proposition. And I have no problem using a lot of business language. To say you're a business does not mean you're a corporation. That's one of the things we need to get over in higher ed. But a term you will never hear me use is calling a student a customer, because that's transactional, and our relationship with students is much deeper than transactional. So it needed a new term, and it needed a new reframing. And so the idea of the student value proposition, which I spoke to, but you also have to get away from the idea of student being a monolithic identity. To truly have a functional student value proposition, you have to consider all the subpopulations that you serve. And in thinking about what's going on now in New York City, for example, CUNY, which has not traditionally been heavy on the workforce side, we're transforming our mission as a university. And at BMCC, we're, I would venture to say, ahead of the game with a lot of the work that we're doing in trying to reach out to incumbent workers, now with micro-credentials, trying to make sure that, knowing that a lot of our students are coming from disadvantaged populations. At BMCC, 70% of our students come from families, households making $30,000 or less. We also know recently from data that 70% of our students had were either looking for a job before COVID or had lost their job. So what our value proposition, even for the majority of our students who are recent high school graduates, would have been a year and a half ago, is not the same as what it is now. And so we have to make those transformations. We have to make those transitions. And every decision that we make, all the work that we do, should emanate from that value proposition. And so the ways we support the value proposition are first and foremost with key resources, which is the second part of the business model. Key resources in the case of a community college, you've got human resources, you've got physical resources, you've got intangible resources. The most important resource that we have is the human resources. The reason for that is part 3 of the business model, which is delivery of the product. And yes, we have a product. The product within community colleges is the educational experience. Well, an educational experience is built by faculty and by staff primarily. So that's our primary resource. That is the resource which, as community colleges, we need to recognize, we need to grow, we need to leverage, provide professional development, provide opportunities for these folks to lead at the institutions. And by doing that, we have a better shot. The physical resources, this is an interesting one because for many years, it's always been about building up the biggest, best, the baddest facilities that you could, the most modern and all of this. There's nobody on our campus right now. And for anybody who thinks that once this pandemic is over, that we're going to go back, not just at BMCC, but in higher ed, to the sort of mostly, in some cases, up to 90% face-to-face education, let me disabuse you of that notion. That is not going to be the case. Hybrid is here to stay. That's going to happen for reasons of funding. That's going to happen for reasons of new student populations and having to meet their needs and them wanting some hybrids, some in person. It's also going to come from the fact that there are going to be a lot of folks who are not going to want to be in crowded classrooms for a long period of time, the way they were before, who aren't going to want to be on, the MTA crowded for all of that time. This is going to transform in many ways, but it can be sort of productive dissonance. It can be a disruption that makes us better. So how do we rethink space? How do we rethink technology? And from the intangible perspective, it's partnerships. How do we rethink partnerships in this realm? Who are we partnering with? And also something called tacit knowledge. I don't have a ton of time to get into that, but that's the knowledge that people accumulate over their lifetime, which they store and which they may or may not provide to the institution in which they work. They only do so if it's an environment that supports them and encourages to bring them forward. There's a really good story, in the book. I'm really not trying to do a tease, but I guess it's kind of a tease, but about 2 individuals who were in plant operations who loved horses and found a way to incorporate that love for horses into changing the professional development work at a college. The only reason they even thought about doing that was because it was a welcoming environment. It was one which encouraged them to do so. And so getting into the third part, which is the delivery of the product, right? The educational experience. There's a lot of pieces that go into that. There's, as I break down in the book, there's mechanisms, there's process, and there's structure. Well, if you think of process, that's the thing that means a lot to people. That's why they come to work there. It's the teaching, advising, counseling, working in the library. How do those things change and how do they need to change as we better understand our students, as we know what is and is not working? How do new pedagogical approaches, culturally relevant, culturally sustaining pedagogies, in a time like now, trauma-informed pedagogy, these type of pedagogies, how are we supporting our faculty to learn about them, to bring them into the classroom? The same goes with like culture of care and our student-facing staff. How are we supporting them in that regard? In thinking about the mechanisms, what does an academic department mean in a new environment where workforce and traditional higher ed, where the line is blurred, where it's about career development and preparation? And as an example of that, Hampshire College, which is was really going out of business a few years ago, they totally reformed what they were doing. They brought together students, alumni, staff, faculty, parents, legislators, accreditors, everybody to reformulate what they were doing at the college to determine what their product should be. And this was a private liberal arts college. Well, if you take a look now at what their gen ed curriculum has, it has internships, career development built into gen ed. For those of you who are not, new to higher ed, that doesn't happen. That's not the kind of thing that you typically find in these residential liberal arts private colleges. But they're actually building the idea of career and understanding career and opportunities for paid work into their general education curriculum. This is where the thinking needs to go, but they only got there because they were ready to close. What I would like, and what I'm hoping the book will do, is to encourage colleges to be proactive enough, to be innovative enough before they get to that point, which gets to the last, part of it, which is the profit formula. And this is a difficult area to talk about because our current deficits, we're not going to be able to cut our way out of them. We're not going to be able to play around the edges. We're going to need intervention, large-scale intervention from the federal government and from our states. That being said, it doesn't absolve us of serving our students and of continuing to find ways to find new resources. We can't just continue to cut support services that we know are impactful. In listening to Zamaris, she was talking about the CUNY at home. Well, we have ASAP. We have BLA, our BMCC Learning Academy, College Discovery. We have Project Impact, which is a program now that we're trying to grow, where we're working with students who are formerly incarcerated and getting them back into the system. We have so many of these. And guess what? They cost a lot. But if you take a look at the return on investment, it's exceptional. And so as an institution, how can we take the long view on what these investments mean? And how can we make sure that what we are both raising and what we are reducing with constraints and costs cutting, how is that benefiting the student value proposition? How is that improving the overall educational experience? There are always ways to do it. There are ways to get grants and do other things to do that. With the CARES money, for example, we can't use that money to, plug the hole in our budget. But what we're looking at doing right now is supporting thousands of students and paying for their classes this semester. Well, that's something that we can do, right? The $30 million that we were fortunate to get through Miss Mackenzie Scott, we were one of the few community colleges to get it. And I think the reason why, frankly, is because we've been doing redesign work for 3 or 4 years. Our student outcomes have been going up, and there's a lot of positive elements. Right now, our Latinas, are graduating at a higher rate than any other population almost at our college, with the exception of, I think, Asian men. That was not the case 4 years ago, 5 years ago, but there's been a lot of work, redesign work, going back and questioning everything we're doing and looking from pre-enrollment to getting a college degree and moving beyond. That's really what the business model book is about, is helping colleges to have the hard conversations, to look deep at what they're doing, to integrate work, and to really make sure that you're not just saying student-centered, because I have to be honest, I'm kind of tired of hearing that. It's really more of a jargon when I hear we're student-focused, we're student-centered. I believe that's your intention, but let me audit your policies and your practices. And we did that at BMCC, and we found that some of them were not where they needed to be. And so it's a matter of making those major changes and transforming it. The last thing was about how to move from concept to implementation. I'll go quickly through this and looking at the time. There's, in my opinion, really 2 major things. And then there's a third, which is helpful. The first and foremost is you've got to have the leadership at the institution to do it. The best ideas, from my experience, percolate up, they bubble up, like I was talking about tacit knowledge, but you have to have the individuals in the decision-making areas who are going to take advantage of that and who are going to ensure that there's the type of culture where individuals have that opportunity for leadership. Like at BMCC with our major bodies now, we usually have those run by faculty and staff, and we take cabinet members and make them liaisons or part of a support team. As part of really encouraging that. You have to have that. But secondly, you have to have a culture that's ready for it. A metaphor that I've started to use a lot, and if you ever hear me speak or read the book, you'll know I love metaphors. You'll also know that most of my family's originally from the South, and my first job out of my PhD program was working in the Mississippi Delta. So I have a real feel for metaphors, especially those about getting your hands dirty. So tilling has been one that's really been key for me recently. And I started thinking about it like, you can have the right amount of rain, you can have the best seed, you can have the right amount of sun, the right amount of humidity. But if that soil is not tilled and made ready for that seed, nothing's going to grow. And if the roots and the rocks and all the weeds aren't removed, they're going to choke off any life. And so it really is a process of making sure that within that organizational culture, that culture is tilled to be ready for organizational change efforts. Otherwise, you're going to get folks who, because of sense making, will go back to what they know or will resist. In some cases, you've got history, which has been a major impediment, and people use that against any organizational change effort. New leadership, whatever it may be, unless the organization is really tilled for that, major organizational change is not going to happen. And trust me, I've been in strategic planning and doing work like that for almost 20 years at this point. That is child's play compared to trying to put a business model in place. This is much heavier lift. for many reasons. And so it requires that. And the third thing, which is nice, but not necessary, is you need some sort of a vehicle for it to work. For us, it was engaging in an intentional redesign effort, and then becoming part of AACC's guided pathways, which forced us to look at things. And we folded, and I'm thankful to our previous interim president and provost, Karen Wilkes, for really supporting, the work that we were doing in tying strategic planning into organizational change. Our strategic plan went live about 2 weeks ago, and we're now rolling out a whole lot of new planning efforts, but it's all linked back at the end to this set of student success indicators and making the value proposition, the core of what we do. And I would encourage not just colleges, but not-for-profits to also do the same thing. Really get to know who your students are. In the book, there's a great example of Amarillo College and how they know that their typical student is named Maria. And how do they know that? Through predictive analytics and other things. And they looked and they were like, we are not designed to serve Maria. That's why Maria's not being successful. At BMCC, we are looking at what we're doing. We're like, we're not fully designed to get where we need to. We've gone from 18 to 25% graduation rate increase in 5 years. That's good, but that's incremental. We need much better. Amarillo went from 16% to 50% in 6 years because of engaging in the business model type work that we're trying to implement at BMCC, and I hope other colleges do. There's examples out there, a lot of them, that this does work, and it really doesn't, I would say it builds on what is good about the academy, about academe, about higher ed, and about being a social business. And it really gets us to shake off some of the old thinking, outdated thinking, and some of the, basically the lethargic principles, which relegate us to mediocre success. That's where we have to go. We've been recognized for our social mobility, one of the top 5 community colleges for 4 straight years. 40% of our students jump 2 economic quintiles. That's 60% that's not. That's the part that should keep us up at night. That's the kind of thing that I think a business model is helpful for.
Thank you, Dean Schultz. I have so many thoughts and questions circling in my head, but I've also had the opportunity to talk to you at other times and and hopefully in future occasions. I really want to give the panelists a chance to reflect or ask Dean Schultz any questions. Anyone volunteering to kick it off? All right, Zamaris, excellent.
I just wanted to take a moment, Christopher, to just point out that I think it's amazing work, what you've done with your book. I used to think of the perspective after working with Apple for 3 years. This company is so advanced because they're so innovative, and they focus on not only training you to do the job at Apple, but training you overall on your skill set that you can take with you and apply it outside of work or in any job that you go to. And, I talk about them so much because they've had such an impact on me. And now hearing you talk about this work that you're doing with this book and what you're hoping it would do, I think that this is going to do wonders. I mean, I think people nowadays, when it comes down to businesses, schools, anything, I think people need to start thinking, being more innovative when they're applying new things, because things are changing. Technology keeps advancing. We all have different backgrounds, but I think that when we're talking about change, it doesn't come in very easy for a lot of people to adapt to change because they're stuck on what's always been and what's always worked for them. Not thinking of how it could help a lot more people. The innovation, it's amazing. And I am actually really going to read your book. Like, I am so intrigued to read this book now, based on the things that you were talking about. And thank you for doing that. I think that's amazing work.
Oh, thank you, Zamaris. I appreciate that. And frankly, a lot of the innovations that have worked within higher ed have come from corporate America. And in talking to Russell Lowry Hart, and if you don't know who that is, please look him up. He's the president at Amarillo College. He started the no excuses policy. And during the pandemic, by the way, he sent staff away from the basic needs office, and that's where he relocated his president's office so that he was the one who students saw. This is a guy who really, truly gets it. He's presented to the Senate panels like 2 or 3 times. He told me, and it's in the book, that this no excuses policy and the way that they work came from the students encouraging them to talk with Zappos. And so they started working with Zappos about sort of the way they do things, and they reformed their college, not the values, yeah, the values. So the values were rewritten by the students, and the values are things like wow and yes. And the reason for those 2 things is they want every interaction a student has with a faculty or staff member to end with wow. And they want to say no they want to say yes as often as possible, and to try not to say no. That came from corporate and using these corporate principles, but then contextualizing them for the work we do. And that's where higher ed often falls short, is we think nothing good can come from an organization that is focused on making a profit. The truth is we can take what they're doing and we can transform it, because profit is not our goal, but we need to get slack so that we can serve our students. And he told me, and he's willing to tell other people, he had to stop looking at higher ed for innovation because he wasn't finding any. And so it's okay for us to look outside of higher ed and bring what works in. So I'm glad to hear what you're saying about Apple. I fully agree. And yeah, let me know what you think about the book after you read it. I'd love to hear your thoughts.
I would definitely, for sure.
Julia, I'm sure that last statement in the previous ones has your mind working. So any particular thoughts and reflections from you or questions?
Yeah, maybe one reflection, and Chris, just to tee this up, I think having you walk through either some of the nuts and bolts of intentional redesign or the kind of audit approach you mentioned would be helpful for the audience, just getting really brass tacks of like, how do you do this within an organizational structure? But I think, reflecting both on your comments and Zamaris, we know that hope is not a strategy. We also know that sometimes strategic plans are not a strategy if you don't have the mechanisms to change processes. And our definition of a business model, it varies very slightly from what Dean Schultz has sort of written in the book, but it has a lot of similarities. And it's the relationship between your resources, processes, priorities, and value proposition. And processes are the ones that are the most intransient, that really calcify. So I think as much as community colleges are facing an immense resource shortage, it can be oversimplifying the innovation process to say resource shortages are what keep us from innovating. What actually keeps you from innovating is entrenched processes. And I actually think we heard that, even in Zamaris's first example of having many advisors who were not aligned, right? You had the human resources at a student's disposal, but they weren't working together in a way that, sorry, Chris, I'm going to use this term, is student-centered, right? That aligned around her needs, or that coordinated across them. And I'll just share one reflection from outside of higher education, since you opened that door, of how to change processes. It's really hard to do if you keep people in their departmental structures, because they're always going to respond to the same incentives that those structures were set up to accommodate in the first place. So when Toyota was first creating the first hybrid, like Prius car, they had to pull people into what they've dubbed a heavyweight team out of their departmental structures, so that the engineers would be willing to rethink product design for a hybrid vehicle, so that the salespeople would understand, oh, this is a different customer set and a different value proposition. And so that the different parts of a literal car would work together differently and be optimized differently. And that, I think, and I'm curious, Dean Schultz, if this resonates, like, how do you pull people out of their current departmental structures, not to do away with those departments, you need them for efficiency purposes, but to kind of clear the deck for new processes to take root. Does that make sense? That's a real jargony question, but I feel like maybe if you can talk through the intentional redesign work you've been doing, it can shed light on how other organizations could do this work.
Chris, I'm just going to jump in while you absorb that question. I really want to thank Zamaris for joining us, but I believe she has to go at about now because she has to go back to her work. She was kind enough to take her lunch hour to join us. But want to thank you, Zamaris, for all your insights and thoughts and feedback and continued partnership in this work. And thank you so much. And obviously you're welcome to stay on. I just didn't want to miss the moment and have you have to sign off.
Oh no, of course. You'll be hearing more from me, Abby. This will be the last time I'll volunteer. I was super excited to be here and thank you for having me, guys. It was nice meeting you all. And Chris, I'll read that book and I'll get back to you. Bye.
Yeah.
Thank you, Zamaris.
Bye.
All right, Chris, turning it back over to you.
Well, with the intentional redesign work, it comes out of design thinking and intentional design literature, which there's this quote, and I don't like saying quotes when I can't attribute it, but I can't remember the guy's name, and it's such a great quote. It's used in Achieving the Dream, which is you achieve the success you're designed to achieve. And so if you start with that principle, you then start with those hard conversations about whether or not you're okay with a 24% graduation rate of 3-year students when 70 or 80% of our students say they want to. So what happens between the time they get there and the time they don't? You have to start by having those really hard conversations. And a good example of auditing that has occurred was in a redesign that we went through with what we're calling our Panther Station, which is the system whereby students enter into the college. And what they did was they took a look at average time for students to be seen, the average time they were in the queue, the average time they had to come back for multiple questions. And so they were redesigning their entire system around what they were finding were the issues. Now it's a work in progress, but they continue to work on that. And that same area also did an audit of their communications to students using a growth mindset perspective as opposed to sort of what was there. And it was interesting because some of the commentary, it was not meant to be negative, but some of it read almost like, good for you, you failed. Now here's what you have to do if you want to come back, versus using language that was more friendly. And for the record, I don't have an issue with the term student centered. I think we all need to be. My problem is I think we all use that without actually evaluating whether or not it's true. And I think that's the problem. So that was a big part of this process. And we had a diversity, equity, and inclusion group, which was pulled together to begin looking at data, disaggregating it to levels that we never had before, which is where we identified issues, especially with our Black and Hispanic men, with retention, graduation, probation, and all of these sorts of things. We started to put in sort of smaller efforts. And an interesting thing is BMCC, like a lot of other colleges, I think, as you begin to go into this intentional redesign, but that's not the way you've traditionally operated, you still have those really high energy entrepreneurial folk who are going to work together and create this small thing that affects this group of people, and this who groups this group of people, and this project that affects this group of people. And what happened during our intentional redesign process through support from this equity and inclusion group, and then us leading the most robust group, robust set of focus groups that I've ever been involved with. In a 2-year period, we spoke to almost 1,000 faculty, staff, and students. And that was the major data point, what we learned from there in creating our new strategic plan, was we went back to the beneficiaries, to use the word from the business model book, is identifying who our primary beneficiaries are. It's number one, the students, but in a lot of cases, it's also faculty and staff, especially when you look at process and service and how it impacts them as well. And so we started having a lot of hard conversations. We had 6 different subcommittees looking at 6 different sets of issues. They spent a year really digging into that, gathering data, having discussions. There was a lot of meetings for myself and our staff and trying to encourage this, bringing in assessments and unit review data. And then the strategic planning committee took all of that work that was done for a year and continued it on for another year. So our strategic planning process was designed to take 2 years. It was designed to end in April or May of 2020. I don't know, did something happen last spring? So then it continued into the summer. And then we got a new president. So then it was looking at it, and he came in and he identified other gaps, and then we reworked it again. So we had a strategic planning process that has taken 30 months with a lot of new data points. And during that time, we've been redesigning process. We have been doing audits. One of the big things, and I'm proud of this right now, is we are completely looking to rework our probation process, because we've realized that it's punitive. And so now it's a matter of, what do we do? There is the will now to change it, whereas that will did not exist before. We still have to find ways to ensure that students get the hand holding and the handoffs that are necessary. But there is now the will. And that will is because of looking at what was happening, understanding how it's impacting students, and then being part of this larger effort where everything's being questioned. That's the other thing. In intentional design, everything gets questioned. Far too often, colleges will find a problem point, a pressure point, and they will focus on that. And what happens when you do that is that the individuals who are involved with that, they take offense. They get into a defensive stance. They go back into their sort of departments where they feel safe. And then it becomes us versus them. Well, if nobody's safe, then everybody's free to say what's going on, right? The book from years ago that I love, Sacred Cows Make the Best Hamburgers. It's that kind of philosophy that there is nothing so sacred except student success. And when you take a look and a student's success is not where you want it to be, then everything needs to be questioned. And I think that's how you make it real. The nuts and bolts are things like strategic planning, intentional redesign, using these major institutional bodies where you pull cabinet off of driving it. That's where you do it, and that's how you begin to make changes.
Thanks, Dean Schultz. I think it's fantastic to the specific examples that show how you're tilling culture change is really, really helpful. And I feel like there's a whole nother book that has those little stories that we all can use. And I'm going to use Sacred Cows Make the Best Hamburgers for sure on multiple occasions. So thank you for that. I want to make sure we leave time for questions and answers, but really want to hear from Apoor, particularly in the context of the work that you're leading at Here to Here in the field around codifying some of best practice and figuring out how to make best practice common practice, and not just sitting on a page, but really how the work moves forward. And after that, I'll turn it over to questions. So we have a couple of questions in the queue, but please keep them coming. So Apoor.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I mean, there's so much, Dean Schultz, of what you're saying that is really resonating in so many different ways, and particularly around sort of the work that Here to Here is engaged in. I mean, I think you've been talking about redesign. I think you mentioned also sort of kind of mission sort of transformation, and I think that's one thing that's really sort of ringing true to me in terms of what we sort of need to be doing in this space. Even obviously including sort of colleges, community colleges, but even more broadly. When we talk about public education, workforce development, and this idea of a sort of a talent development system that benefits young people, employers, educators, the city at large, is really sort of thinking about what the vision for that is, and really sort of recalibrating what our goals are and what we sort of think is possible with these public systems. There's no reason that should sort of remain sort of stagnant, even as the world around us sort of evolves. So I think that idea of sort of coming together sort of around a new mission, a new vision, a new set of priorities, a new idea of what's possible, I think is something that really sort of speaks to me. And I think the work that we're trying to sort of do at Here to Here, because I do sort of feel like that's then sort of a prerequisite to then really identifying those sort of pain points and figuring out sort of, and being really honest and really blunt and really direct about what's not working and how we're not fulfilling our missions, which then I think leads to sort of well, not the final step, but the next step of putting forward those really sort of bold sort of solutions and putting that model together of what we think is going to work and taking from innovations from other parts of the country and best practices and things that we do know to work, but that too often sort of exist in these little pockets, but that aren't sort of properly integrated into a whole system. So it makes me think a lot about sort of the interconnectivity of different systems, of how the community colleges benefit when when high schools undergo their own sort of processes, when CBOs undergo their own sort of redesigns and processes, and all sort of, and I think the work of Here to Here in large part is sort of trying to bring all of those sort of stakeholders together and say, let's sort of collectively work on doing that, on coming up with that vision, on identifying those pain points, and on sort of driving the solutions forward based on building off of what we know works, building off of what we some of the things that are already in place. So that's really a lot of what we're trying to sort of do at Here to Here. We've worked with partners to sort of create our sort of core principles behind this sort of vision of braided academics and work, which we refer to as our key distinguishers of integrated work-based learning. And really what we sort of want to focus on sort of moving forward is sort of bringing all of those stakeholders together, from young people to educators and CBOs and employers, to really sort of do that work of redesigning our talent development system, so that it's really sort of taking advantage of and leveraging all of our collective strengths, our collective knowledge, recognizing what's not working, and really sort of taking what's working and really sort of embedding it as part of a system that kind of works for everybody. So I think there's a lot to learn, Dean Schultz, sort of from your book and the way you sort of talk about and amplify these things. And it's something that Here to Here is certainly sort of trying to do, with our own work, as we think about how we sort of try to create a system in New York City that really works for all young people as they go through high school, into post-secondary, if that's the route they take, or straight into careers, if that's the route they take, but making sure that we're sort of building off of best practices and that we're all sort of aligned on what the system vision is. And we're all sort of, I think there would be a lot of agreement in terms of the things that aren't working so well, and some of the solutions for what we could do to make those things work better. But to actually sort of move forward together on that vision, I think is a challenge, but certainly a challenge I think Here to Here and its partners I think are game for.
And I think as we open up to questions, so please keep them coming in, is also very much recognizing that it's a practice and it's practitioner driven. So how do we, I thought, Dean Schultz, you highlighted so many particular examples and experiences, both in your book, as well as your work now at BMCC. How do we bring that up so other practitioners at other community colleges and other educational institutions, or at other institutions generally, who are trying to do this work, learn from that, have somewhat of a playbook, so it doesn't just sort of stay with it at the individual or institutional level, but really is a body of work that we can all sort of mobilize and champion together. So I'm excited to keep learning more now that you've kicked off the strategic plan at BMCC, and are living it in your own institution right now as we go. I'm going to start with questions. We have about 10 minutes to 10 to 15 minutes for questions if folks still have them, although I'm sure the panelists have additional questions for Dean Schultz or for anyone on the panel. This one's for you, Chris. It's as key purveyors of the educational experience, how do you see faculty conditions evolving in the community college business model? In what ways do you see students in roles as peer mentors in many program delivery models at CUNY as part of the business model? Looking forward to reading your book. That's from Lee McCallan.
Well, thanks for that question. Actually, within the book, in the human resources section, the last of the human resources I put is students. And the reason I put students in there, but I said we cannot look to students to solve what ails us. That being said, we do know that student coaches, peer mentors, peer advisors, peer tutors, it works, and it actually works in two ways. It amplifies not only the students who are getting the mentoring or the advising or the tutoring, but it also amplifies the students who are providing it. When we take a look at propensity matched students, we find incredible gains in regards to GPA, retention, graduation, transfer, all of these things. All of that works. And by the way, supplemental instruction at BMCC is something that we're looking to grow. And that's where you have a student working hand in hand with a faculty member to provide support. And if you think about it, depending on the relationship, and going back to the idea of relationships earlier that Julie was talking about, when you have that really strong relationship and the SI instructor, for example, is allowed into the classroom, they see things that the faculty member does not, and they can have conversations about classroom management, pedagogical approaches, the type of information, because students sometimes won't want to ask questions, but this SI leader can see where possibly there's a concept that was not understood. That can absolutely be leveraged. In regards to faculty, I make no bones about it. I believe out of any population that is serving our students, the single most important is the faculty member. And the reason is, first and foremost, as a faculty member, you're who the students are going to trust most. And you will have the greatest impact, either positive or unfortunately negative. It will be faculty members. And so faculty labor needs to be absolutely valued. It needs to be supported. It needs to be grown. It needs to be leveraged. We need to find ways continually to make sure that faculty are given leadership opportunities, that major academic decisions are done so in partnership with faculty where possible. A good example I can give of that is at BMCC right now with the evaluation, student evaluation of faculty. We've got an instruction committee that's working on it. I am good with basically trying to completely get rid of the old style of student evaluation of faculty. We don't have anywhere else in our society where we ask those who are not experts to grade for the purpose of their promotion and tenure how well they're doing. Now, it can be incredibly helpful and incredibly useful if we're looking at student experiences in the classroom and how that can inform faculty pedagogy and how they change their management techniques and their professional practice. And so that's got to be recognized. That's got to be supported with institutional dollars, with offices that support it, professional development. We have a Center for Education for Teaching and Learning and Scholarship. And that's like a really good avenue where you have faculty, teaching faculty. We had this really interesting, for example, workshop that we provided during our last African Heritage Month. It was a faculty member who approached me and then worked with CEDLs to create this workshop called "For My Fellow White Faculty: How to Check Your White Privilege at the Door." Right? That's not a workshop that can be created by an administrator. Okay. That's got to be a faculty member speaking to faculty out of respect for what's going on and knowing what's going on in the field. And that's got to be encouraged, leveraged, and grown. And colleges that don't make that a priority are really losing out on their ability to provide this exceptional educational experience. It's got to be a partnership. This us versus them, administration is this, faculty is this. That stuff is tired and it's old and it's way past its time. It doesn't benefit the students or anybody else. And so we've got to work for the kind of equality that's necessary in guiding our colleges and in respecting the labor of faculty. And that is definitely a core principle in the book.
Thanks, Dean Schultz. I love the next question. Before I do it, I know many of the folks who are on the call, I know you guys are all very curious and usually ask a lot of questions. So I encourage you to continue to ask questions because I don't have any more coming in after this one. That's on my screen right now. But this is one of my favorite. It's from Nathaniel Palmer. How do you get others to move from a fixed mindset to a growth mindset in terms of the student value proposition? And one of the reasons I love this question is that so often adults are always talking about young people and having growth mindset. And if you look around the room, the people who don't have the growth mindset are the adults in the room. And I feel like a lot of, my and our team's day-to-day work is talking to adults about a growth mindset. So I'd love to hear your answer. And Julia, feel free to jump in on this one too.
So I am glad for that question. We do often hear growth mindset just from like workshops and other things that we're doing with the students. But when you take a look at individuals who are student front facing, and you realize that they've got a fixed mindset. What about when advisors see a certain GPA from students in high school and say, you can't be a nurse. There's no way. Let's get you into another program. You're no good in math. Let's put you over here. I can tell you that it was an advisor like that who, now granted, I'm happy I am where I am now, but I wanted to study physics, but I struggled with math in high school. And so they told me to go into social sciences where I didn't have to do the heavy lift with the physics. who knows? I might have gone a different route. And, looking back at what's going on now, I think I would have been very good in physics. That's one of the areas where it's most problematic, is that from the moment students step foot into our campus, theoretically now, not necessarily always physically, but having growth mindset for anybody within the intake process, having having fixed mindset in those areas, or having a fixed mindset within the classroom, really not only sends these negative signals, but really can impact overall student success. And so some of the ways that you do this in higher ed are, you provide, workshops, you provide trainings, you bring people through. That works to, a certain degree. That really is based on individuals wanting to change. Now, what you can do is leadership, mandating that individuals go through it by using things like secret shoppers. That's a way to do it and see whether or not things are really changing. We've seen that. Another way to do it is to change the evaluation structure. Now, obviously, that doesn't work on the faculty side, but with staff, that can actually absolutely be done. You can build that into annual evaluations, that there has to be certain things. And if you don't see it, you can build in a development plan to do it. Also with hiring practices, this is a good way to do it. In the very hiring practice, you try to figure out with your questions whether or not somebody has a growth or a fixed mindset, whether or not there's somebody who's focused on culture of care. You build that into the process so that you're bringing in individuals in the first place who have it. And then you're working through, your HR process, your professional development opportunities to make sure that there are opportunities to grow. At the end of the day, frankly, it's very hard to force people to do that. But I think the more you have the conversations about the value proposition, the more that you take a look at the data and you see what is and is not working, and you understand more the deeper issues through the qualitative work, the individuals who are at the college, most of whom are there because they want to be there, frankly, they're going to begin to see the light and see that they need to make changes. And another, final thing I would say is, you actually see some of the biggest issues with fixed mindset in institutional policies. They are sort of dictating what students can and cannot do, as opposed to giving opportunities for them to exceed expectations. And so that's another major area where I see, and that's one that I think is easier to deal with, is looking at process and practice and policy and identifying whether or not they appear to have a fixed mindset.
I'll just chime in with just a few additional thoughts. I love this question too, Abby Jo. I think I'm actually going to pull on research that we've done in the K-12 space on what's motivated teachers to shift their instructional practices or to be amenable to sort of new innovative ways of doing in their classrooms. And one of the big insights that revealed is that willingness to innovate is not a personality trait. It's a reflection of your circumstances. And you always hear the sort of like veteran educators won't use technology. We have these tropes that we need to retire because they're inaccurate. And they, I think, give a lot of short shrift to actually understanding the circumstances different faculty and administrators are in and how they are defining progress in their lives. And if we can understand those circumstances and how they're defining progress, either you can shift the circumstances to make redesign a more appealing endeavor, or right, you can offer redesign, maybe not even calling it redesign, just to sound blunt, right? Because they may be looking to reach the students right in front of them and not be interested in rethinking the entire business model, right? Like the business model conversation needs to happen, but there may be needs that they want to meet first that actually align around redesign, but you don't have to sort of boil the ocean with them. So that's just a takeaway we've seen of like not over rotating on this, like indicting people's personalities as not innovative or willing or having a status quo bias, because it just doesn't bear out in the research.
I'm actually glad you brought up real quickly the point about they don't have to be involved in the whole business model conversation. No, absolutely not. And I would dissuade colleges from trying to get everybody involved in every aspect of it. What we need to do is we need to recognize their expertise, and we need to equitably recognize their expertise. One of the issues in community colleges is oftentimes staff get short shrifted for the sake of faculty. And that's something that needs to change. And policies and practices in a lot of cases have been created, I hate to say it, but it's true, really to benefit faculty. If you look at like scheduling and things like that, it's not based on student schedules. It's often based on, when people want to teach and how they want to teach and what they want to teach. And while we need to respect that, and we do, at the end of the day, is that supporting students? And so that's the conversation I would like faculty to have. It's not necessarily the whole business model, but let's take a look at your courses. Let's take a look at your professional practice. Let's take a look at all of these areas. And is it benefiting the student? That's how you get them to focus on the value proposition without saying value proposition. That's how you get people to focus on the business model without saying business model. Is you get them focused in the areas in which they are most passionate. And frankly, what we need is more people who are passionately passionate about what they do, because those will be the ones that are willing to innovate.
Thank you, both Julia and Dean Schultz, for that. I thought I'm looking at this screen. I'm like, I'm glad we're recording it, because I feel like there's so much I need to go back and listen to it. And a number of people asked in the chat whether this is recorded. It is recorded, and we'll share it on our website so folks can refer folks to it, and those of us can go over it again. Our board chair, Judy Diamond, had a last question, which we'll take, although make sure everybody's ready for like 30-second wrap up when we do a speed round on why we think this work is so important and why it's so important right now. Judy says, in our work at Here to Here with large companies, we found that the leadership, management, and staff of these companies know and have invested a lot in training, internships, and now multi-year apprenticeships, all paid. They are ready, willing, and able to work with faculty members to build out an accredited program that aligns with applied and academic learning and makes the most out of students' time. Where the challenge is in getting the colleges to co-design these experiences to be credit-bearing. Any thoughts from, I will particularly look at Dean Schultz and at Julia on that specifically, given their work.
Well, we're going through that right now, and what we are focused on, frankly, is finding the faculty who are the ones who are willing to be champions for that kind of work. It's going to be different with every college. I can just speak to BMCC and the fact that, frankly, for many years, adult and continuing education was not prioritized at our college, and we were doing the work, but I think nothing speaks to it probably more than the fact that our adult continuing education is located at 25 Broadway, and the rest of the college, for the most part, is at 199 Chambers. I mean, just that distance communicates the issue. Now, there's been greater work between academic affairs and adult and continuing education in the recent years, but I have to say that is probably the biggest pain point, is those two areas not working in sync. There needs to be a blurring of the lines between non-credit and credit, and a blurring of the lines between workforce development and education, traditional academic programming, and a blurring of the lines between education and training, because those are all connected. And colleges that don't recognize that will not appreciate the opportunities and will not appreciate, frankly, the charge that they have to provide that for students. I gave numbers earlier about how many of our students are needing work. Well, what we want to do, and what we're starting to do, and what colleges need to do, is to take a look at micro-credentials into stackable credentials into certificates. And one of the areas that we're starting to look at, and more colleges need to, is you can get federal funding for less than 1-year certificates. That's something that a lot of colleges have not done. We've looked at the 2-year certificates. Well, in thinking about the economy right now in New York, we need to have 12-week, 16-week, 20-week, you get a credential that gets you a job and gets you some credits so that you continue building towards a job that will be paying you $55,000 or more, which is the, what our aim is at BMCC is to grow that. So the way that you deal with it, frankly, is you have to have the adult continuing ed non-credit side of the house and the academics side of the house. And that's a problem. The fact that I'm saying side of the house, but that's the way it typically lives, as opposed to being on the same team, which has been kind of the issue. That's where the idea of a business model comes in, is that we focus on value proposition, and that requires the linkage of the non-credit and the credit and the academic programming in the workforce, and giving students multiple entry and exit points so that they can continue along the path without being penalized, so that they get financial aid where possible. And again, that requires some creative curricular development, and that's where you find your innovative faculty. It's not always your chairs, it's not always your senior faculty. We've got a guy at BMCC who's been there 3 or 4 years, and he's into entrepreneurship, and he's already launched 2 new programs. So it's finding those folks, giving them support, taking them through faculty development institutes, attaching them with the grants development office so that they're able to write these powerful grants. And we just got a grant where we're working with Kauffman. Kauffman never works with community colleges. That's incredibly unusual. And I've known about Kauffman since 2003, when I was working in Michigan with Schoolcraft College, who was doing work with them. This is unusual space. It shouldn't be, but the times have forced colleges, I think, to be more innovative. So now is the time to ask those questions, as Ms. Dench did, and to force colleges to think about that, because we're not serving our students if we're not preparing them for work. They tell us that's what they need. 70% of our students are in need of a paycheck. We know that our enrollment has gone down partially because students can't afford to pay. Community college enrollments across the country are down 20% right now. And a lot of that is because these are the colleges where students need a job to be able to pay for an education. And so we need to find more ways for the paid internships and paid programming. That only happens through greater partnerships with workforce partners.
Thank you, Dean Schultz. I think we're at 4:30, so as much as I really want to hear the last question, I'll stay on to hear it, but I don't want to keep the panel, the attendees and the panelists beyond time. And I think that was a great way to end this conversation. And all that you're saying, Dean Schultz, is such music to our ears, and really excited to have your partnership, Julia, your partnership, Apoor, your leadership, and everyone who's been attending this panel, and the other folks who weren't able to attend, because I'm optimistic that we can use this moment in time where there's so much is changing, and particularly when it comes to the workforce and how we do education, that we have a huge opportunity for us to take to move forward in a different direction, to better prepare students, to have student success, employer success, and the economy be what we want it to be, which is much more inclusive and thriving. So thank you, everybody. Particular thank to our panelists. If we can turn everybody on to clap, I appreciate your time, and we'll be following up and continuing to work on this together. Thank you.
Thank you, Abby Jo.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Did you say you wanted to ask the last question?
The last question I was going to ask for those who are still on is just, why is this work in, reinventing the community college business model so important right now? And that way we can all go and make sure your book gets read far and wide, so we move forward. So that's what I was hoping to get each of your thoughts on.
Well, I want to give someone else the last word, so I'll just put in my 2 cents really quickly. Abby, you alluded to in your closing, but I just think the moment in time really sort of demands it. I think even prior to the pandemic, and even prior to the sort of renewed kind of focus on racial justice, which should have never needed to be renewed, with changes in the labor market, with globalization, automation, everything else, I think we are well past time actually where we need to really sort of rethink the way we do things. I think the pandemic and the way we're looking at racial justice issues now, I think underscores that, even more, that we need to really rethink the way we're preparing young people for careers. We need to think big, and we need to think boldly.
Yeah, I agree with Apoor on all those ambitious fronts. I think I'll just say again why I'm so excited about Dean Schultz's book is that affordability and access are the name of the game, and where higher ed in general needs to start to optimize, and community colleges, that ought to be their main charge, and to maintain that and to actually survive requires a real rethinking of the business model, not to not to sort of count dollars and cents, but to continue to serve as many students as possible on pathways to sort of high return on investment careers. So I just think that if we go back to the original premise of our community colleges and reinvest in them, but also reimagine them, we can deliver on a lot of the rhetoric in higher ed policy and reform right now that we're not actually seeing happen yet.
I'm going to let you, Chris, have the last word. So I'm just going to say, I think that it's so urgent, as I said before, but also just sort of this concept of elevating student career success. And so it's not just about completion or access, but really launching and thriving in careers and lifelong and continuing and recognizing that we're doing it in a dynamic time. And then how do we move away from having it so best practice just sits in certain places and you're lucky to be there, but it actually, and we often say, how do you make best practice common practice? So how do we get it so it's not just at BMCC, but it's throughout CUNY, it's not just at some high schools, it's throughout DOE, it's not just some employers, but it's just how we hire and train and support talent. So really sort of thinking that through, I think we are at a critical time here in New York, but frankly in the US in general, where if we don't rethink this, it's just going to continue to have larger social challenges and continue to have the inequities that don't work for anybody, and particularly don't work well for Black and Brown students. But I'm going to let you have the last word. And by the way, everybody who's still on, buy and read Chris's book.
Well, thank you for that. I really do appreciate the platform and the opportunity to talk about it. I'm an academic writer. I'm never going to get rich off of people buying the book, so I'm certainly not asking people to do it for that reason, but I firmly believe in what's in this book. I tried to put all my 20 years in higher ed honestly into it, with all that I've learned from the different areas. And frankly, one of the main reasons that I wrote it is, you know, speaking completely frankly, I'm sick and tired of mediocrity when it comes to student success. You know, I was that student. I did not do incredibly well in high school. I was fortunate to go to a college where I had some folks who really pushed me and encouraged me and supported me, but that should have been the norm, not the exception. And so, you know, for far too long in the community college world, we've been trying to defend student success metrics that are not there. So it is about access, it is about affordability, but none of that means anything without academic and then career and lifelong success. And so that's what I am hoping that the book helps to usher in. Within CUNY, it comes to leadership. We have a new chancellor who is pushing this conversation. We've got vice chancellors and deans at Central that are meeting and really encouraging and pushing innovation in ways that it hasn't been. And that's going to help within our system, is having that leadership. And whether it's BMCC or Baruch or Bronx Community College or whatever it is, if they're doing something well, it's going to be brought to the attention of all. And I think that's really going to help make a difference. And that's what we need, you know, across this country, is in our fragmented, you know, higher ed world. We need more of these groups talking to each other, learning from each other, and just taking practices that work, hoping by bringing some of them to light in the book, hopefully that will encourage more of it.
Fantastic. Thank you. I wish we were all in a room together, because now we could eat and drink and be merry, and hopefully we'll be able to do that again soon, because that's the best way to end one of these panels or book talks. So we'll have to put a pin in that to reconvene to do just that. And thank you. Thank you for your time, insights, and the conversation.
All right. Thank you all.
Bye all.
All right.